أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. In the name of Allah, the all gracious, the all merciful, we take refuge in God from Satan and the rejected. I'm in your presence about the topic of communications. And if you remember in our previous 6 sessions and episodes, we talked about different issues in regard with the definition, types, and also the characteristics of good communications. And also we talked about the information richness and the levels and the hierarchy of the communications and the best and the worst type of communication. However, we have provided you with some text materials that you can refer for detailed and more detailed and very, as a matter of fact, good gallery of the information and as a matter of fact, well-documented texts in regard with communications that will be offered by the MOU University. Today we are going to talk about the topic of the characteristics of effective communicator. You know, communications or the process of communication is a very dynamic process. And if a good process of communication is going to be successful, each of the parts and the elements of the communication process must be well qualified and must contain some qualifications and characteristics which enhance the quality and the success of the level of the communication. Today, the communicator is in our focus. You know, in an effective or the effective or influential communicator is a person who is mastered at 2 sides. First one of them is in the verbal phase, and the second is in non-verbal phase. A good communicator is a person who uses the techniques of good verbal communications, such as clarifications. I mean, if a communicator is going to be successful in his communication, must clarify his subject, must clarify, as a matter of fact, the thing that he's going to talk about. Clarification is very important. In the process of communication, clarification is very important. That what is the meaning that you are following? What is the best and the foremost and the priority of the communication that you are following? The other technique and the other characteristics is that the good communicator must be a good listener. You know, is a person who is talking. The realm that I'm talking about is the interpersonal communication. You know, IPC. In interpersonal communication, the person who is a good communicator must be a good listener. It means that he must listen to the topic that is talked about. For example, if a person is lecturing, you know, he or she must be a good listener to the audience, that what is their, for example, demand, what is their need, and what is the level of their education, and talks according to the level of them. The other one is the, as a matter of fact, acknowledgements or acknowledging. This is the characteristic that gives the communicator the power to, as a matter of fact, recognize the other and to understand the other is also a person or a group or, for example, anyone who worth to listen to and must be acknowledged and must be confirmed and must be recognized. This is very important. And also there are some other characteristics of the good qualifications of the communicator in verbal communications. That is, for example, the encouragements and also restatements or repeating, and also, for example, the empathically encouragements for the audience and for the counterpart. And for the non-verbal phase, that is the second phase of the, as a matter of fact, a person who is getting communication, is that the person must be well mastered in body language. In interpersonal communication, that is the best form of the communication. If you remember, we talked about different types of communication, that the face-to-face or F-to-F communication is the best form. The person must be mastered in body language. What does it mean, the body language? Body language is the language of your body, about your facial expressions, about your looks, about your eye contacts, about your, for example, shape of your looks, and also about the movements of your hands, about your own movements on the scene, or etc. So if the body language or the gestures, or for example the looks or the facial expressions are not accompanied with the first type, which was the verbal communication, this communication cannot be successful. Suppose or consider, for example, a lecturer who is just frozen in his chair, and he doesn't move, for example, and talks to the audience in an open scene, for example, and this is very bothering, and it is very tiresome. The person will be tired soon. But if you use, for example, the movements of hands, for example, if you start talking on the scene, or you start, for example, move from one part to the other part, or for example sometimes show some special eye contacts or facial expressions, that will change the process of communication. That is very good in the interpersonal communication. And also there are some other characteristics of a good communicator. For example, to be relaxed. It is very important when you are communicating with others to be relaxed, to consider the counterpart as a person like yourself, and do not be, for example, a person who is in rush, and a person who is not flexible and relaxed person, because it harms the process of communication. So relaxation in your communication, no matter to whom you are talking or with whom you are communicating, as a matter of fact, will be influential in the process of communication. And these are the main techniques of a good communicator. So, good communicator is a person who is mastered at both sides of verbal and non-verbal communication. So, in brief, what I talked about in the three former sessions, the knowledge and the skills needed for effective interpersonal communication are as followed. First, adequate knowledge of the subject area. Second, an understanding of one's own values and willingness to withhold judgment about the other person's values. Third one, skills in verbal and non-verbal communication. Fourth, ability to show empathy and encourage the others. Fifth one is the skills in asking questions and listening. The sixth one is the tolerance and patience. This is a very key term and key point, that the person who is communicating in the process of interpersonal communication must be patient person, a person who has tolerance and patience. There is difference between patience and tolerance. Patience is to be patient about anything which is not pleasant for you, okay? Or sometimes this is something that mostly physical. For example, the weather is not suitable, for example, for example, the facilities that are used in the process of communication, the channels, I don't know, the other parts and the goods are not, or these instruments are not okay. So this is one kind of patient. But if you are listening to the opposite voice, although you don't accept that voice and that opinion or that idea, meanwhile you are patient, that becomes tolerance. So tolerance is being patient in front of the opposite voice and ideas. The other ability which is needed is the ability to paraphrase and summarize the concerns of the individuals and the community or the people you are communicating to. So this is another, as a matter of fact, ability for interpersonal communication. Ability to observe and interpret behavior of the other people. Ability to use language that other people understand. The skills to effectively use support materials which is very important and are the best channels for transferring the the knowledge, the science, the ideas, and also all the things that the communicator is looking for. Confidence and flexibility. So these are the groups of skills and also knowledge that the person needs in interpersonal communication. So in interpersonal communication, one person must be mastered, as a matter of fact, at its most to be effectively successful in the process of communication, and that M and M prime to be equal with 1. Now we open another part, which is about the barriers to communication. In interpersonal communication, which is the focus of our communication, since it is very important and the techniques which are used are very important in the process of the propagation also, is that we have to know about the barriers of communications. What are the barriers, limitations? In technical words, in other words, what are the noises which makes the process of communication problematic? The first barrier in the process of communication is the language. Language has two meanings here. First of all, it is as a matter of the popular meaning or the popular point, which, for example, refers to different languages. For example, English, French, Spanish, German, I don't know, Dutch, or etc. These are some of the languages that, if you don't know the audience language, so the process of communication is not at all complete. The other thing which is also included in the issue of the language is the cultural fact. The culture is also a language. I mean, if you know the audience culture, that how you communicate or, for example, talk to your audience according to his or her culture, it is a language by itself. If in Quran we have that أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وما أرسلنا من رسول إلا بلسان قومه بلسان قومه, that the translation is as follows: that we didn't send any prophet but with the language of that, for example, that group of the people that prophet is communicating to, or to the people of that prophet. So prophets were sent with the language of their own tribes and their own people. So here, first refers that, for example, Prophet of Islam sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke Arabic, and the other is that he knew the culture of the Arabs of that time. So he communicated with the people in that sense and in that level. So the first barrier which can harm the process of the communication is the language. So we have to be mastered. The good communicator is a person that in interpersonal communication, in Tabigh, to know the for example, the audience's language. The other point is the values and the beliefs. You know, if the person does not know the norms, the beliefs, and the values of the other side, it will be also problematic. For example, you start talking to a Christian about the Jesus the Christ, for example, but you consider Jesus the Christ as a prophet, but he considers him as one God, one part of Trinity, one person. Okay, so when you talk according to the beliefs of your audience and you are not well aware of them, it will be problematic and it will harm the process. So for the first step, if you want to effectively communicate with the other, so with, for example, non-Muslim, with those who are following other religions, for example, this was an instance, you have to know their beliefs and the value system of the audience. Okay, for example, in Iran there are some values which are very important, but these values, for example, in a secular country is not at all important. Okay, for example, saying hello, saying salam, or for example giving food or donations in the time of shahada of our, for example, imams, or for example in the shahada of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in the day of Ashura, for example in the morning days of Muharram and Safar. For example, when you talk, when you give your donations, your nadr or endowments to the people, this is a value here. But if you want to do the same in the other country, they cannot understand what is the context. What are you doing? Okay, so in interpersonal communication, okay, or IPC, you have to know the values and the beliefs of the other side and the norms of the society that the person has grown up. The other point is the other limitation is the gender and also the age. For example, if a male is talking to a female, he must observe some rules and some etiquette, some disciplines. Okay, if he does not observe that discipline, and also vice versa. For example, if a lady is talking to a man and doesn't observe some of the rules, okay, it can be a barrier to the process of communication. It must be very different. For example, when you go to an office and talk to a person which is from the opposite gender, for example, you have to know that you have to talk to her officially, and also to observe some of the rules. Age also is one of the limitations. For example, when you talk to a young is different from when you talk to an old person. Okay, when you talk to your son or to your daughter is very different when you are talking to your parents or grandparents. Okay, so the amount of the knowledge that you use for the lower ages are very different from those who are the elders. So if you don't consider these fact and this element, also again the process of communication would be in problem. The other barrier in the issue of the interpersonal communication is the economic status and the educational level of the addressee. So for example, when you are talking to a person who is from good education, for example, who is one of the students of the universities, for example, from any disciplines, okay, it is different from talking to a person who is not from amongst the educated level, and that is very different. And also the economic status. A person who is rich talking to a person who is not rich is different, and he must be very aware that what are the words and the phrases that he or she is using when he is talking to the other person. The other barrier is the physical barriers. For example, you have problem in your tongue, you have problem in your ears, you have problem in the supporting materials, you have problem in the channel, you have problem in your hands, you have problem in your body language, you have problem in all kinds of physical problems that can be a barrier and blockage to the process of communication, and it will harm the interpersonal communication or F2F communication, which is the best form of the communication. Also, one of the points and the barriers can be attitude, that inshallah in the next session I will continue this topic. So until another episode talking about the barriers of interpersonal communication. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.